Hello, welcome to tonight's presentation titled Diversity Within the Law by me, Brandon Najera, and we're going to get started with the presentation. So before we get started, want to give a land acknowledgement. UCSD resides on unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The UCSD community holds great respect for the land and the indigenous people that first resided where we are currently located. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that the Kumeyaay people continue to have political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge and continue to amplify and uplift the Kumeyaay Nation for their contributions to the UCSD community and greater San Diego community. And this was adapted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. So hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Najera, pronouns he, him, his. I am an affiliate and leadership intern over at the Cross-Cultural Center, and I'm also a social justice educator, and I will be the person who will be presenting to you tonight. So as we go into our presentation talking about diversity within the law, I wanted to give a quick breakdown of what the presentation is going to look like. And we'll be starting off by talking about defining key terms. So we'll be learning about important definitions that will be important to keep in mind throughout the presentation, since we'll be referring to them a good amount through the presentation. Next, after that, we're going to be talking about what does diversity look like within the law field. Mainly looking at how diversity has looked like within the past and also what it's looking like now in the present. We're going to talk about what is being done to improve diversity, looking at to see how diversity is growing, what is being implemented, like what measures or what are just people doing in general to make sure the diversity is being kept in these spaces. And lastly, I'm going to share a little portion called Student Opinion. And these are basically from students who are interested in law. I asked a little bit of students on why they were interested, why diversity matters to them, and we'll be sharing and we'll be seeing their opinions and learning about why they believe that it's important for them. So as mentioned, we're going to get started with key terms. And I want you to keep these terms in mind, especially because with a lot of the information that I'm going to be sharing today, a lot of it is statistics and a lot of it is knowledge that if you may not be in the law field, you may not know what I'm talking about, but I wanted to share these key terms so you kind of get an understanding and have that general knowledge of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So what are some key terms that we're going to be talking about? Well, first, we're going to be talking about the word diversity. Diversity is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc. It's important to mention diversity because when talking about the law, we want to look at the scope of diversity and what it means to have a diverse law field. But also when we talk about diversity, we also have to talk about representation since they go hand in hand. And you cannot have diversity without having representation as well. So representation is the description or portrayal of someone or something in a particular way or as being of a certain nature. Again, important to highlight because both of them go hand in hand. And I believe that when you talk about diversity, especially within the law field, there has to be some form of representation for the people coming from diverse backgrounds. So these are two important terms that I want you to keep in mind. Next, we're going to be talking about what I mean when I say the law field. When I talk about law, I'm not talking about the judicial system. I'm focusing more on the field itself, particularly looking at lawyers, people/places who practice the law. Again, this whole presentation is talking about diversity within law and primarily looking at the law field. So this is just important to note because I want there to be a distinction when talking about the judicial system and stuff that happens there, but also just the field of law itself, which is what we're going to be looking at tonight. And then also, I wanted to give a breakdown in regards to what law school is, because there is a portion of that I talk about law school. And I understand, as mentioned earlier, that people who are here tonight may not be really interested or may not know the process of law school. So I wanted to kind of break it down in general for you to understand what it means when I mention law school. So the law school process goes as follows. Students pursue a 4-year undergraduate degree. They could take it at any university and they could do various different majors. And then After that, they take the LSAT and they fill out applications for law school, which of this costs money. The LSAT costs around $200 to take, and as well as you have to pay to actually send your applications to different law schools. So it's important to note that this process, this journey takes a lot of money. And if accepted, a student attends law schools for another 4 years to then take the bar exam. One thing that I wanted to note also when talking about law schools, because I do mention it briefly later on in the presentation, is that I'm going to talk about lower ranked law schools. When I mention lower ranked law schools, I'm not talking about oh, like this is not a good law school per se. It's more just due to the fact that law schools have a general ranking depending on their field of emphasis or just how they're viewed in terms of how well their school is performing in terms of law and like getting students in and then getting students to pass the bar exam. So when I talked about lower ranked schools, this is kind of the process that I'm talking about, that they may not have the best resources for students who want to pursue law, or may not have like that high turnout rate of students who become lawyers later on down the line. And then next, another thing that I wanted to mention, because I think it's important to highlight, is that we're going to be talking about law partners and law associates. When I talk about law partners are joint owners and business directors of the legal operation. Basically, like these are going to be the people that you see with their names plastered across the buildings. These are the names of the people that you're going to be seeing when you walk into these buildings. Those are the people who basically own and run the operation. And that's who you see when you talk about law partners. And when you talk about law associates are employees of the firm with the prospect of becoming partners. What this means is that they're essentially employees working amongst the rest of the staff, and they support the actual operations of the firm with the hopes of one day becoming law partners alongside the people who are already running the firm. So those are some key terms that I wanted to mention, and I know there's a lot of key terms that I mentioned, but keep them in mind as we'll kind of retrace our steps back to them when I get onto them on the rest of the presentation. So the first question that I have for y'all tonight is I wanted to know, what do you know about diversity within the law field? And what are some general assumptions when it comes to the law field? Just a reminder, if you're going to send something on the chat, feel free to set chat to everyone so we can see those messages. For me, when I jumped into this topic, I actually knew little or nothing about diversity within the law field, especially just considering that I haven't put a lot of time or research into this topic before the making of this presentation. So it was something that I genuinely knew nothing about. But I assumed that the law field was very just diverse in general, especially talking and noting about how diversity, the reason why there's a lot of like DEI requirements or just diversity implementations like around anywhere that you see, is the fact that lawyers have fought for it, that courtrooms have fought for it. But as you'll kind of find to know, that isn't actually the reflection of the career or the field in general that you'll see tonight. But I see some folks have shared in the chat. So I think I'm looking over the chat. Y'all have shared some very good things. I see that law is rich for people. Diversity within the legal field is slim, not much diversity. It is unattainable for POC and very intimidating. Wow, genuinely a lot of great information that y'all are sharing, and definitely different from my experience, but I think, yeah, no, thank you everyone for sharing. And we'll continue on with the presentation to see if a lot of what you know about diversity is right or not. So first part of the presentation, now after moving past key terms, we're going to be talking about diversity within the law field. A question that I would like to have you keep in mind is what does diversity look like within the law field? Keep that in mind as we go through this little portion of the presentation right now. But before we jump into statistics and facts, I actually wanted to share a video So this video is by Bloomingburg Law, and it basically summarizes why there's an issue of diversity within the law and why it's actually one of the least diverse professions. This video is 3 minutes and 35 seconds long, and it quickly summarizes what we're going to go over with the rest of the presentation. And I think it does a great job at summarizing it and putting it into like a 3-minute video than rather than breaking it down with all the statistics. So I'm gonna actually unshare so we could go in full screen and watch the video together.
It's an irony that the profession that's been leading the struggle to equalize the playing field in most of Americans' workplaces has done such a poor job in its own. Law is the least diverse profession, and people of color are at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. Women, although they're over half of entering law students in many law schools and comprise about a third of the profession, are only 17% of the equity partners in large law firms, and they are less than 10% of managing partners and only about a fifth of Fortune 500 general counsel. Figures for minorities are even bleaker, with the numbers of equity partners hovering around, I think it's about 3%. You can't account for the difference in women's promotion to partnership by any objective measures. So something else is going on, and there's been a cottage industry of research on the prevalence of unconscious bias, sometimes called implicit bias, in the culture generally, and there's no reason to think that law firms are an exception. I recently conducted a survey of managing partners at the American Law's 100 largest firms and general counsel of Fortune 100 companies. They hadn't figured out ways that they could really affect promotion, particularly the promotion practices, retention, and distribution of opportunities within the firms that translate into differences in promotion and retention. It's not rocket science what you need to do. You need to really make sure that career development opportunities are evenly distributed. And it's still true that women and minorities lack the presumption of competence that's enjoyed by white men. You have to break down those patterns of unconscious bias and make sure that you're distributing opportunities for professional growth equally, and that you're looking for ways to involve women and diversity in management responsibilities within the firm. And as one managing partner put it, well, we do a lot of programs on the subject, but I'm not sure women have time to attend. They need to do more than programs. They need to make part-time tracks and reduced schedules workable and not indications of second-class status and diminished responsibility. They also need to look at the distribution of professional opportunities. Not all of women's underrepresentation at the partnership level can be attributed to the work-family conflicts. Some of it has to do with exclusion from the old boys network, from the informal networks of career development and client development that are necessary for professional success.
So after watching that video, I think that this video does a really great job at summarizing everything, especially just considering the fact that there's a lot of information that goes, there's a lot of numbers that goes into actually looking and viewing diversity within the law field, because there's a lot of studies that are being done that shows that there is little to no diversity within the law field. So one of the things that we have to look at is actually just the best way to look at diversity is look at not only the lawyers, but also look at the law firms who are basically running the show when you think about the law field. And it's sad to see that a lot of these professions, whether it be just lawyers or law firms, have been dominated by white men. And I wanted to share some statistics in order for you to just get a general glimpse of what it looks like when I say that, the law field is being dominated by white men. So in 2018, 85% of lawyers in the US were Caucasian, according to the American Bar Association. Believe it or not, that number in 2020 has only continued to go up. So it means that there's progress that needs to be made, especially with how much of a big portion that they are dominating the lawyers that represent the American Bar Association. Also noting that a report on diversity in US law firms found that racially diverse women are the most underrepresented group in the legal profession. Other diverse groups underrepresented include LGBTQ plus lawyers, lawyers with disabilities, Hispanic/Latinx lawyers, and Black/African lawyers. So when it comes to talking about people of color within the law field, as you can see by a graph on the right-hand side, there really is little to no diversity. And this is actually statistics that have been found by the American Bar Association this past 2020. So it's been 2 years since this information has been up. But just looking at the graph, there's a lot, as you can see, there's little to no representation. As I said, the number has actually increased with now in 2020, it being 86%. If you look at African American, it says that there's 5%, Hispanic, Latinx, 5%, Asian, 2%, multiracial, 2%, and 0.4 Native American. As you can see, it really is not a diverse field, especially when we're just looking at lawyers. And here are some other information that I wanted to share, especially when just looking at the different minority groups that we're representing. So in 2020, the American Bar Association, the Profile of Legal Profession, collected data revealing that African American attorneys represent just 5% of all attorneys in America. Only 9% of partners are African American. When it comes to Black attorney representation at an amount of 5%, this has actually remained unchanged for the last 10 years. So with this information being found in 2020, if you go back to 2010, it has not changed, and lawyers who identify as Black or African American it's been at 5% for a good while. So it's very stagnant at the moment. When you look at Asian, as you can see, it says 2% of all lawyers are Asian, up slightly from 1.6% 10 years earlier, while the US population is 5.9% Asian. And then again, looking at Native American, less than 1/2 of 1% of all lawyers, 0.4%, to be a little bit more specific, are Native American. And it's actually down when in 2010, it was 0.7%. And this translates to with the US population being 1.3% Native American. As you can see, the numbers are not adding up. With people who represents lawyer or people who identify as lawyers, and especially within minority groups, in comparison to how they match up with how much they represent in the US, you can see that there's a really big margin or big gap of who is actually being in the profession or who is representing our various communities within this profession. And also, one of the things that I wanted to mention that the video mentioned was just also talking about what it means for people of color to be law firm partners or associates of color. As you can see, another graph on the right-hand side, found by the same report of 2020 by the American Bar Association, it shows that there's a really big discrepancy between who are law firm partners and associates of color. Or who are law firm partners of color and then associates of color. There's genuinely such a big gap as well that hasn't really gone up since 2010. As you can see on the right-hand side, starting with 2009, you can see that it says 6.1% of people, partners of color, that's how they identified. And then looking at, again, 2009, associates of color is 19.7. So as you can see, while the number does go up, it does go increasingly up to 25.4 in 2019. For associates of color, it doesn't really translate much to partners of color. So as you can see, this little orange bar represents that while there is a little slight uphill climb for this, it doesn't mean that partners of color are being fully represented within the sphere, especially considering that, again, people of color who make up the law field, it can only be between 5%. So it shows that there's a lot of work that needs to be done with upping who are law firm partners, and even still upping associates of color, because again, the number 25%, that still isn't a really big margin when talking about the rest of the law sphere. And here are just some other statistics that I wanted to share that pertain to Latinx and Hispanic folks who identify within the law field. So according to statistics from the Hispanic National Bar Association, Hispanics, who are 18% of the population, comprise about 4% of US lawyers. This information was found prior to the research now that is being done in 2020. So as you can see, that there was a little switch between 4% and 5%. And here are just some other notes that I wanted for you to consider, especially when talking about Latinx lawyers. Looking at that, Hispanics are 1.8% of law firm partners and 4.5% of federal and state judicial positions. And in California, where Latinos comprise about 40% of the population, a 2015 study found that only 9% of prosecutors were Latino. And it's important to note, especially considering the fact that if you are in a place like California, where you're trying to represent a certain amount of people, there's a big discrepancy of finding lawyers who do not come from the same community as you or who don't look like you that are representing you. And it's important to note because, again, when we talk about diversity, one of the reasons that I'm going to talk about later on why diversity is important within the law field is the fact that if you're gonna support a multitude of different cultures, different ethnicities, then your field should also be reflective of that. And as we mentioned through the video as well, and also just other things that I've mentioned, women tend to be one of the people who are the least represented, especially when talking about women of color. They are the least represented within the law field. And I wanted to just share some other interesting notes that I found when we talk about Latinas within the law field. And Latinas account for less than 2% of American lawyers, which is a very small portion of numbers when you consider, when you think about that 5% of Latinx lawyers represent the whole sphere of lawyers in America. And then also talking about that they're only 2% of that. So that's a very small margin of people who identify as Latina, who represent American lawyers. And then also in another study that was done by the Hispanic National Bar Association. It was just looking at the fact that they interviewed a good amount of Latina lawyers, and 43% of Latina lawyers felt that they were given opportunities to work directly with or develop relationships with clients. What this means is that there was a good amount of them who did not feel that they were given the right amount of opportunities and right amount of support to actually build those relationships that they needed. And it shows that there needs to be work done when looking at how we should support Latinas who are in this field in particular. And also when we talk about Latinas, we also got to talk about other women of color. And we got to talk about how Black women specifically continue to be significantly underrepresented, making up 8.5% of lawyers when we talk about women of color. But when you talk about Black women, you have to note that they only make up 1.73% of all attorneys. So as you can see, there's a really big discrepancy when we talk about women of color, because as you can see on the right-hand side with this other graph, again, gotten from the same report by the American Bar Association, is the fact that in 2020, 63% of people who identify as male compared to the 37% of people who identify as female. So again, compared to 2010, there was a pretty good incline from 31 to 37, but that doesn't mean that the field is still being split, that the field is being split and that there's a lot of like people who identify as female within the field. And that's also just not even considering that, again, from the 37%, 2% of them identify as Latinas, or like that 1.73% of them identify as Black. So there's still a good amount of people who identify as Caucasian that are dominating the field, as you can see. And here's some other statistics that I wanted to know about women in the law field. A study noted that women of color comprise 15% of all law firm associates, but the percentage of law firm partners who are women of color remains below 4%. As you can see by the graph on the right-hand side, you could see that through 2011 to through 2020, this is basically the graph that kind of shows who stands in, like, being okay, these are people who are associates, these are people who are partners, and these are people who are summer associates. So as you can see, women of color tend to be more summer associates, especially looking at 2011 to 2020. But as you look at, okay, who are the people who are then being promoted to associates after that, the graph got pretty smaller when talking about women of color. And then, not surprisingly, when you go over to partners, and especially just looking at women of color, you can barely see that there's a little graph right there, right above the yellow, that highlights how women of color represent partners. So again, when you talk about associates, and associates are people who basically work trying to be partners, but the people who are actually promoted who are women of color tends to be very slim, as it says below 4%. So it means that they're not being represented in the people who are being chosen to be partners within law firms. And again, that's pretty important to know. And something else that I just wanted to share was the share of lawyers at elite firms who are women, considering that there's not only lawyers in the US, but there's also lawyers in the UK. But here's a little graph that just shows that in the UK, 52% of people who identify as women or female are people who are working at these higher end firms, like these elite firms. But when you look at the US, there's still a pretty big discrepancy of what that looks like. So again, there needs to be work to be done for women to even have a place, especially within these elite law firms. But I think most importantly, it's to note that women of color should definitely be given the chance to be partners, especially with the work that they do within law firms. And going back to the statistics on the left-hand side, I just wanted to share how it looks like the pay discrepancy that happens within the law field, considering that 300,000 or 314,416 was the pay for a white man. Then, as you can see, it goes lower. 210,569 is the pay for men of color. It drops significantly down when you look at white women, but the discrepancy that I wanted to note, the biggest one, is the white man to looking at women lawyers of color, which is 157,290. Which again, that's a really big discrepancy. And it's important to note, because they are not only not being given the opportunities to be partners, are given little opportunities to be associates, they're also getting paid less. So again, important to note that women of color tend to be some of the most underrepresented people when it comes to talking about in the law field as a general scope. But we also got to know different things also within the law field. We can't just talk about, like, we also got to consider other intersectional identities, whether they identify part of the LGBTQ community, and also just looking at people who identify with disabilities. Something to note is that when we talk about disabilities, that only roughly 1/2 of 1% of all lawyers identify that they have a disability, and the numbers are pretty shocking to look at when you consider that so in a survey done they found that 389 lawyers were found with disabilities they did a study over 697 law offices. So that means that only 0.55% out of 70,000 lawyers who were interviewed and just found for this study is slightly more than 1/2. But again, the percentage of law firm partners who have disabilities is nearly the same at 0.6. What all that means is just looking at people who identify like partners with disabilities or associates with disabilities, like the number is extremely low. And again, while the number has gone up since 2010, with it being right here at 0.2%, We're not looking that associates with disabilities are at 0.6, and then partners are still at, it's a little bit above 0.4. There still needs to be a lot of work done in order to make sure that people who identify with disabilities are not only feeling represented, but also just being supported when talking about it, because there's times where people may not feel that the law field is welcoming, especially to folks with who identify with disabilities. And then when we talk about, we also got to talk about the LGBTQ plus community. And through the same research that was done for folks who have disabilities, they did the same type of research where they basically found that 3,000 LGBTQ plus lawyers, they were found at 910 different law offices. So that means that 2.99% of out of 100,000 lawyers at those firms identified as LGBTQ plus. And again, this is when we're going back to the graphs on the right-hand side. When you look at law firm partners and associates, the numbers have increased from 2010 and have spiked up to 4% for LGBTQ plus associates, but the numbers for LGBTQ partners tend to be really low. So again, while these numbers show that there's an incline and that there's something being done, it shows that progress is slowly but steadily happening. But it also just shows that the real discrepancies that are happening within the law field itself. Just because when we talk about race, when we talk about identities, it shows that the numbers aren't really too keen on favoring either folks of color or people who identify as LGBTQ plus or people who have disabilities. So what is the root of the issue? Why is it that there's such a big issue of diversity within the law system? And a lot of people have different answers when it comes to the root of the issue, and many of them can give you different answers. They can either blame law schools, they could blame the LSAT, they could say, as the video mentioned, that there's certain networks, certain traditions that are kept alive within law firms that people need to break out of. A lot of different explanations for why these things are happening. But one of the main things that I saw coming back up was law school. And I wanted to mention law school because the process, as we mentioned, can be tedious and can be very jarring, especially for folks who do not have access to all the latest things to study with, or just have access to funds to pay for all these things. So law school is one of the main barriers that many young students of color face when pursuing law. The reason being is the lack of equitable resources for students. On average, minority students wind up at lower ranked law schools and have lower bar exam passage rates than non-minority students. Again, when we talk about lower ranked law schools, there's a process that goes into them, especially with the trend of, if students aren't being passed into, students aren't passing the bar exam, then that means that the law school isn't really doing its job. They get ranked lower than, say, these prestigious schools, like, when we talk about like Harvard, when we talk about Yale, when we talk about all those Ivy Leagues, those tend to be like the top of the ranks. And so students who aren't doing well may not end up at law schools like that, and they'll end up at lower ranked law schools. And here are just some other things like on why this tends to happen. Like the biggest reason is minority and underprivileged students generally post lower average LSAT scores than white and wealthier test takers. And low LSAT scores translate to lower opportunities for scholarships and access to higher education with better law schools. This is kind of sad to see, especially considering that if you're not doing well, if you don't perform well on the LSAT, and say you end up at a school that gives you a lot of aid or gives you a lot of support via your LSAT score, that means that you're not going to get a lot of support already, which is whether it be funding or just whether it be access to certain things. It already means that you're facing a pretty big discrepancy just by you having a lower score. And doesn't matter what your lower score could be attested to, just means that you will not be getting support from your said law school, which is kind of interesting to note when seeing why a lot of people can point the issue back at like law schools and the LSAT itself. And I wanted to share an LSAT study because I think it is important to note that there is an argument to be made when talking about why the LSAT might be an issue, considering the fact that in 2016 and the 2017 admission cycle, it took about 1,960 Black applicants to yield 1,000 offers of admissions compared to only 1,204 compared to their white applicants. So what this means is that it took almost about 2,000 Black applicants for them to receive 1,000 admission officers or admission offers, when it only took 1,200 for them to give them to white applicants, which is very big to notice that there seems to be that they're passing up on more Black applicants rather than white applicants. And here's something that I wanted to note, that the average LSAT score for Black test takers is 142, while the average for white and Asian test takers is 153. In the next slide, I'm gonna kind of break down what this means a little bit more. But what this just shows is that fact that Black test takers are not scoring high enough or not scoring more in the ideal ranges for law schools. That means that they're most likely going to be denied or not admitted at all to a law school. And it kind of shows because nearly half of Black law school applicants, 49%, were not admitted to a single law school, and the share is larger than that of any other racial or ethnic group. And this little graph at the bottom does a pretty good job. While it may not be the 2016-2017 admission cycle that the study was done by, it's important to know that this trend that was found in 2016-2017 was still kind of carried on over to 2017-2018. Because as you can see, Caucasian, they scored in the higher rates, so 150, 159, as you can see right here, kind of breaks down like, 120, 149, 150, 159, 160, 180. Caucasian they scored in very big ranges, so 159 and 160. When you look at African American, they scored at 9% at 120, 149, and the number decreased from 3 to 1%. Hispanic, Latinx, they face the same issue with 6%, 4%, 2%. Asian, they scored only 2% and 120 to 149, and then the numbers gone up, and other kind of facing the same little decline. But what does it mean when you look at these numbers and what it means to actually be like someone who is applying to law school when you see these numbers? Well, here's a chart that breaks down what it means. So by looking at the previous research that we saw, people who were scoring less than 49 is actually not even an ideal range for people. It's not even reaching the 50% average score of what it means to be a good LSAT score. So as you can see, if your score, say, is given a 149, you are in the 40th percentile, and that's not even ideal when looking at, when you want to score for the LSAT, you want to score in the higher percentiles, whether it be 50th, 60th, or 70th. You would genuinely want to score, and as you can see, like the numbers switch dramatically. From 150 to 159, you jump up from the 50th to the 80th percentile, and that just means that you're most likely to get admitted to a better law school. And it's when you notice the discrepancy between Black applicants, the fact that a lot of them are scoring down here means that they're most likely not going to be given an opportunity to attend law schools, whether or not your GPA be good, whether or not you went to a pretty distinguished undergraduate school. If your LSAT score does not reflect what they'd like to see, then you are most likely not going to get in. And it kind of shows with 49% of Black applicants being denied during the 2016-2017 application cycle. So again, this is also something else that was found when doing that research in the 2016-2017 cycle. Other things to note is that among these scores in the band of many Black law applicants, white applicants are most likely than Black applicants to be admitted. Among Black applicants with an LSAT score between 135 and 149. So as you can see, just to kind of go back, if you scored 139, 149, you'd be on like the more not ideal side of things. If you scored between 135 and 149, 55% of Black applicants received no admission offers. But compared to their white peers, only 39% of them were not given offers. So again, even though they're scoring in the same percentiles, literally same reasons, why is it that only 39% of white applicants are not being offered, or why is it that only 39% are not being offered compared to 50%? So that's something also to note. And as a result, Black applicants who are admitted to law schools enroll at law schools with less desirable outcomes than other law schools. And again, as mentioned back when talking about the research, Black applicants who are admitted to law schools, which use LSAT scores in awarding scholarships, are less than likely to receive non-need based. So it's important just to note that there's a big discrepancy of like what LSAT score can do, which is why a lot of people note that this might be one of the issues when looking at diversity within the field. And here I wanted to actually share with this research being done in 2016, this was actually shared and a lot of people took notice of it. Even one of the people who helped run the LSAT, and this was their statement that they wanted to share. So this is what they said in response to the research that people found. And it was to help improve the representation of African Americans in law school student bodies. It is important to understand the factors that are keeping acceptance rates somewhat lower than rates among other groups, and then to develop strategies to alter those factors. The trends we have observed in applications from African American candidates that affect outcomes include the factors that Mr. Taylor identified, such as submitting applications late in the application cycle and LSAT scores that fall in lower bands. We see other factors as well, such as grades and age at time of application. This is important. I wanted to include this quote because this was a direct response from someone from the LSAT, but I also kind of think that they wanted to, while addressing the research, they also needed to, they noted that there needs to be something else done, especially with supporting folks who are applying to law school. But there's also other factors that go into consideration that people need to keep in mind. But again, as we looked at previously, like there is a really big discrepancy that needs to be addressed, especially with considering if they're looking at just the people who are scoring within these ranges. Why is it that 39% of them who received no 39% of white applicants who received no offer, why is it 39% compared to the 50%? I threw a lot of information at you. I know that there was a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics, but I just wanted to ask for the next check-in question was, after what you've heard, do you believe that more work needs to be done to improve diversity? And was there anything surprising that you learned? Remember to set chat to everyone so we can see your lovely messages and your thoughts on everything that you just learned. I know that for me, especially when I mentioned in the earlier check-in question, was the fact that I thought that there was diversity within the law field, but just looking at straight numbers and statistics literally speaks otherwise. There was literally no type of, I couldn't have been prepared for the numbers that I would have seen. But I think it generally just shows that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And while surprising and shocking, while the numbers have gone up, especially from 2010, it just shows that, to me particularly, that work needs to be done. But you can feel free to keep answering this check-in question as we go on with the presentation. And yeah, just feel free to share in the chat so we can see what you say. Now, after talking about diversity, I wanted to look at diversity improvement. The question that I wanted you to keep in mind for this part of the section is what is being done to improve diversity? So why is it important to even have diversity? Why is it important to have diversity within the field of law? I wanted to share an interview done by a lawyer named Eric Russell, especially wanted to highlight what he said in regards to talking about diversity within the law field. The legal profession should be a reflection of our larger society. It's our obligation to have as many voices, backgrounds, and perspectives as possible represented to best serve our clients and communities. Having a diverse group of voices simply provides a better product for clients. Having people at our firm who think about issues differently, have had different experiences, and understand different perspectives is something that benefits every client relationships we have. This reflects something that I mentioned a little bit earlier with, I believe that it's important to have diversity within the law field, especially considering that if you're serving a community or if you're serving just walks of life, who come just from genuinely different aspects of everything in our community. You're going to need to have that diversity for people to feel comfortable and feel welcome to want to actually share and be a part of, like, going through the process of getting a lawyer. So this is what I think Eric Russell is sharing, and I believe that this is like one of the best quotes that I've seen in regards to why it's important to have a diversity within the field itself. Um, and also, I just wanted to share this little note of something that I believe is really important that he also noted within this interview, talking about diversity, because I think it's really empowering just to note, especially for students who are interested in wanting to pursue law school, which he says, the important advice I received when entering law school was to be confident in who you are and what you're capable of doing. Know that you belong in every room you step into, and then don't shy away from making space for yourself. There will often be times when you are the only person of color in the room. Take pride in the fact that you are representing more than yourself, and stay true to who you are. And again, this quote was by Eric Russell. I really believe that this quote is just not generally just important when talking about law, but especially just being an undergraduate student, say like here at UCSD. I know that for me, when I first joined, there was a sense of imposter syndrome, especially being away from my community that was predominantly that Latinx. I did not genuinely feel very welcomed. But again, sometimes it's important to note that you're representing more than just yourself. You're representing your community, you're representing your family, and there's a lot that goes into mine. So I just wanted to share this quote because I thought it was really beautiful, and hopefully it's a little inspiration to you as well. I wanted to share another video. This video, like the other one, is like 3 minutes and 40 seconds. And it basically talks about an experience that a student has, especially when looking at why it's important to have diversity within the law field. So I'm going to quickly, again, escape from this so we could watch the video on full screen.
My name is Gavin Burrow. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm relocated to Dallas, Texas after Hurricane Katrina. I'm a rising 2L, and I've received my bachelor's degree from East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma in 2018. And I'm just excited to be a part of this experience and to receive this scholarship. It really is lifted a huge burden off of my shoulders. I think diversity is it's something that is just imperative in every area of any profession. I think that you need to understand the importance of diversity to understand how to grow as a business, as a company, and overall grow as society is advancing forward in time. Diversity is just one of those things where it's like, it's not necessarily trying to meet a quota. It's about seeing the talent you would see in majority population as you would in the minority populations, because in every ethnicity, there's someone who's qualified, there is someone who can do the job, and there's someone who can serve effectively. And I think that more so it's important for minorities because a lot of times we grow up in communities, environments where opportunities are very, very limited for us. And so when opportunities are limited, your perspective is limited, and you rely on the options available to you that are just basically you're being told what you're going to do. You know, where I'm from, like I said before, you know, they expect, you know, young Black kids like me to grow up and just become athletes. And if not, then we just have to find a 9-to-5 job and, you know, just work our days away. When in reality, I think that if you could commit to diversity, even outside of the workplace, you can reach, you know, minority youth and help them understand and help them learn, you know, that there's more to the world and there's more to offer than what's been given to you. And I think that once we take initiative on that, you can see society, you can see your workplace or company, you can see your communities grow towards understanding each other, because really I think that the root of all conflict is lack of diversity. And when there's lack of diversity, there's lack of communication between different ethnicities. And when there's lack of communication between different ethnicities, there's unfamiliarity, and so many different types of issues can rise from unfamiliarity and just not knowing your brother or your sister of different colors. And so just diversity is so rooted within the way we live and how we should live that you just can't ignore it. And for that, I'm definitely thankful to Carl Dunleavy for giving me this opportunity to move forward in law school with less of a financial burden on myself, And in a way, it's just lifted that burden to where I can think more clearly and not think about, well, what profession do I need to get?
When you talk about diversity, it's not really just important to look at diversity within like the field itself, but also just in general, like for us to have diversity within all aspects of life. And I think it's important to really highlight that, because when I mention diversity, it's not just within, it shouldn't just be within the field itself, but it should be in all different aspects of the work that we do. And now I just wanted to highlight, so what does diversity look like now? And I wanted to present some research that was that wanted to look back at the research that we looked at, but also I wanted to just highlight in a research done by the Carrington legal team. They put it in the best way that I mentioned a little bit earlier, but that the progress is slowly happening, but it just needs to be a little bit more, it has to go a little bit faster, but the way that it's been going now, there is progress happening, but it's just very slowly. And I just, again, wanted to go over some of like the different graphs that we looked at and kind of show that the numbers are increasing, but that still needs to be, there's a good amount of way that needs to, or a good amount of work that still needs to be done for the numbers to continue to go up. So as mentioned, the folks who identify as Latinx or Black is now up to 5%. But when we talk about people who identify as Black lawyers, the number has not really increased since 2010. So that number has been very stagnant. In 2009 and 2016, the percentage of female lawyers increased to less than 1%, while the percentage of minority lawyers went up by 1%. And a decade ago, in 2009, 6% of law firm partners were Hispanic, African American, Asian, Native American, or mixed race. And in 2019, nearly 10% were. So as you can see, there is some progress being made, but it's just very slowly happening. And the fact that literally only a couple of percentages from a decade ago still means that there still needs work to be done. But it's not to highlight that they don't know that there's an issue, because people clearly do know that there's an issue, and that it's being worked on. And also, again, just going back to earlier research that we talked about, 3 years earlier, the survey found that 2,431 LGBTQ plus lawyers at American law firms, which is 2.48% of all lawyers. And in 2009, 1.4% of all law firm partners were LGBTQ plus. So today it's gone up to 2.1. And then when we're looking at 2009, this was research done earlier before 2020, and the number is now at 2.4. So it means that there is, again, there's numbers going up, especially when talking about LGBTQ plus lawyers, and also people who identify with a disability, as people who identify with a disability is double today than what it was a decade ago. And it went from 0.5% to 1%. And same when we talk about partners within law firms, it has now doubled between 0.2% and 0.3%, which it's actually, or it's now doubled when it actually in the past decade fluctuated between 0.2% and 0.3%. My mistake for that little error. But as you can see, there's people who identify with disabilities, the number is going up, and there was an increase when it talks about people for partners within law firms. But again, it's only gone up slightly, just a little bit from a decade ago. So what is actually being done in order to improve the fact that there's diversity within the field? Well, one, starting with law firms and companies now have D&I, so diversity and inclusion programs, to ensure that their companies are getting people who are getting hired, but also who are being supported. As I mentioned before, when we talk about diversity, there also needs to be representation, and it goes hand in hand. And you can't just have people within within the law field just because they identify as a certain way, just to have them as a quota, as the video the student mentioned. It shouldn't be a quota. People should genuinely be supported and should be wanted there for their expertise. So that's something that's really important, in noting that people are hiring like actual HR. There's HR departments now to make sure that people of color are being hired within the field. Also is that schools are also taking significant steps in order to ensure that students of color are supported through the law school process. Some of these changes include the law schools are now accepting the GRE instead of the LSAT. Through my research, I saw that some actually pretty high prestigious Ivy Leagues are now accepting the GRE instead of the LSAT. One is that there's more scholarships for students of color. In the video that we watched earlier, it was actually the student receiving a scholarship and talking about like the importance of why diversity should be. So I think it's really cool just to highlight that, you know, students are actually getting these scholarships to continue their law degrees. Also, there's DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to ensure that students are getting accepted into law schools. Just now means that people are highlighting and noting that there is an issue, and we should be supporting our students of color to make sure that they ensure acceptance into some of these law schools. And then also something that I found interesting as someone who is going through the process of applying to law school was the fact the Law School Admission Council, which is like, they basically run like all the LSATs and everything. They now highlight students of diverse backgrounds and offer tips for students applying as well as resources. So if you ever want to go through to like the Law School Admission Council and go through, like, they have little different checks on talking about like, oh yeah, like this is what it means. Like say, if you're applying as like an LGBTQ plus student, or applying as a Black student or a Latinx student, they offer different scholarships, or they just offer tips and experiences from students who identify within those identities and they shared like their experiences. So I think it's really cool that people are noting that there's an issue and that there's work being done for it. So it's important to note that moving forward, schools are doing their part to ensure that students of color are feeling supported and feeling welcomed within these law schools. And lastly, one other checking question that I have for y'all, after all this information that I shared, do you believe that diversity is important within the law field? Why or why not do you think it is important? Again, feel free to set chat to everyone so we can hear your lovely thoughts. So you could share that in the chat. I would love to see what people have to say, but also I know that I don't want to go over 6:30 as much. So please feel free to just share your opinions and thoughts in the chat, and I'll keep going and definitely look at them after. So yeah, I just want to hear what everyone thinks, especially with all the information that we covered. And then lastly, the last part of our presentation is highlighting student voices. And a question that I want you to keep in mind, which is actually what I asked some of my peers, was the fact that why is it important to see someone like you within these fields of work? So I wanted to highlight two students that actually are also going through the process. Well, a student who is going through the process and a student who wants to aspire to go through the process of the law school. And I wanted to share their opinions and thoughts because I think it's important to highlight why students of color want to see diversity within places like this. So student one shares that I think it's incredibly important growing up that people are able to see themselves in all aspects of society. When it comes to careers like law, having diversity encourages others to pursue this work that otherwise can often seem out of reach to those less well off. Diversity in law ensures systems of justice work for everyone, and in different perspectives can create a more open and equitable courtroom. And then student two shares that I think there's a myth that law can be colorblind and not take race and other identities into consideration. However, I feel that it is not the case because for a long history, law has had taken race, sex, gender, and other identities into consideration to benefit the status quo of white supremacy. With more people of color, we got the agency to fight against laws that harm us and improve the system. And I just really wanted to highlight these people that I asked because these are just genuine experiences on why students believe that there should be more diversity within the law, and I just really wanted to share their experiences. So especially with going through relating back to like they want to go pursue law. But yeah, as we wrap up near our presentation, I just wanted to share what do I hope you take away from this presentation, especially after looking at all those numbers, looking at what is being done now. I just wanted to share two quick things on what I hope you take away from this presentation. So to folks who are inspiring lawyers like myself, I hope that this inspires you to continue to push and fight for a seat at the table. We are more than capable to be in those positions and be the faces to support our community needs. And I think it's important to just know that because people come from all different forms of different communities. I know that I come from a different community that, say, to some people here at the presentation today, but that doesn't mean that we should not fight for our seat at the table and represent our communities. And I just think it's important to note that. And as well as to people who aren't interested in law, who are here tonight or watching this later, this isn't an issue just limited to law. Many professions and careers lack diversity, so it is up to you and others to ensure future generations have representation and inclusion in these fields, because you never know who will be looking up to you when you enter these fields of careers that you want to do. You might inspire someone who comes from a similar background, similar identity as you, to pursue that work. So hopefully that's what you take away from this presentation. And I wanted to just leave you off with one more quote, because I think it was a beautiful way to wrap up the presentation, especially when talking about diversity, which is, we all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what their color. And this quote comes from Maya Angelou. So that's the end of our presentation. I just wanted to give you a really big thank you for those who are in attendance today and for those who watch this recording later. Also, just want to give a big shout out to where I work, and obviously got to give them the representation for allowing me to do this presentation. So don't forget, if you have any questions or just have any requests about anything, you could email cccenter@ucsd.edu. Follow us on Instagram. Our Instagram is popping. Make sure, so go over there, follow us to keep track on all the latest presentations happening. There's going to be a lot of presentations, not particularly like this, but presentations happening later on next year as well. So follow us at UCSD Cross-Cultural Center. Make sure to also follow our Facebook, YouTube, and our e-news. And if you want to if you don't have the time to type any of that in, you can also scan us with our Linktree that has links to everything. And also just wanted to give you the little QR code that I included all the sources that I use in my presentation, because I think it's important for y'all to also see that I'm not just giving these numbers out from just giving them out. You can look at all the sources and all the research that I did for the presentation. But again, just a really big thank you. I know that I went a little bit over time, but I really appreciate everyone who came out tonight. And yeah, no, thank you so much. So have a nice rest of your night.